Day 281 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. And as always, I'll start off with those Russian military losses. So as of the 1st of December 22, so in the last 24-hour reporting period, there has been 580 Russian military personnel losses, approximately there. Then when we take a look at the hardware losses, so armored combat vehicles, an additional 5 Russian losses, tanks 1 and artillery 2. Then we'll move back to the map, and we'll quickly start out in Moscow, so in Russia, where several strategic fires have broken out across, in fact, the larger area of Russia. So starting off, we have this thermal power plant in the Russian city of Perm, where an explosion broke out here. Then moving on, actually in Moscow itself, there is something burning near the center there as well. Volgograd decided to join the burning festivities as well. And in Bryansk, Russia again, just next to the Ukrainian border, fuel tanks are burning too. Now I'm only limiting this to potential military strategic targets, such as the thermal power plant or the fuel tanks, things like that. Because it would be a waste of time to talk about the residential buildings burning, of which, fires do happen, so let's ignore all of those ones. But here we're potentially looking at partisans that are against the war. Then we'll move across into the actual Ukrainian map itself, so particularly the Donbass there, where Russian sources reported that the armed forces of Ukraine have now been spotted just 3 to 5 miles, or about 5 to 6 kilometers, west of Zaitlivka, so right here. In fact, if we pull out the ruler and have a quick look, we'll see, that's about 5 or 6 kilometers, or 3 to 5 miles there. Which means that the Ukrainian forces have gained much more territory than what this map would otherwise officially indicate, at least for right now, as the Ukrainian armed forces continue to engage in offensive operations in the region. And then moving across, so the Ukrainian army reportedly targeted the Starobilsk railway bridge. So this is in Luhansk, now just over the Adar River. So 2 HIMARS projectiles hit the target. I'm sure we can find it, right there. Now we are waiting for further images of the destruction, but it is well within the range of, say, many weapon systems, not the least of which is HIMARS. So 64 kilometers, that's about 40 miles or so. So that's looking like quite an inland target, but certainly quite reachable by the armed forces of Ukraine. Then we move down to the central Donbass region, where a combination of both snow and wet, muddy conditions continue to coexist for now, making it difficult for either side to perform any meaningful offensive operations. But while the weather holds up, Russia is throwing everything they can into this region right now. In fact, some radio interceptions of Russian commanders showed they refer to their soldiers as odnorazovy, which roughly equates to disposables or throwaways, but a more direct translation actually is single use. Which just goes to show how it's not just the higher level of politicians and army generals that are very accepting of this cannon fodder approach, but also these ground-based commanders as well. But let's take a look at Bakhmut itself, a place that's been largely abandoned by its 70,000 residents. Now we have several aerial photos that show Russian fortifications near the city in the nearby village of Volodymyrivka. So fighting in the Donbass center front lines has really and remarkably descended into World War I trench warfare, which is heavily employed by the Russian army in contrast to Ukraine's more limited usage. You see, the trench warfare advantage in the modern era has since largely been negated by the introduction of tanks and aircrafts, and now small commercial drones as well. If I had $1 for every time I saw the footage of a small Ukrainian drone traveling to neighboring Russian trenches and then dropping a small device that made a blast, then I'd have about $150. But as I said, the Russian forces are throwing everything they have into the region, particularly on the south side of Bakhmut, where they almost captured the settlement of Opyetny, as you can see right there. In fact, at first, Russia took a larger area of land here, but then the Ukrainian armed forces counterattacked, pushing the Russian forces back a few hundred yards. And then also in this region, particularly around this area, we also have the Ukrainian Air Force, who continues to operate around Bakhmut, attacking Russian positions as well. Then we move across to the Zaporizhia Oblast. So, in the last day, the Ukrainian forces have been performing high-precision strikes on a whole plethora of locations here, including Tokmak, Poloy, Novoselivka, and various other locations as well. Which reminds me of how the Russian forces, who just a few days ago were quite widely reporting of an upcoming offensive operation in this region from the Ukrainian side. And it seems they were right. Only problem is, it's the HIMARS strike in which Russian forces have some real deficiencies in protecting themselves against. Then I'll move across to Kherson, where despite the lack of steady power infrastructure, the Ukrainian civilians in the North Bank are still celebrating the liberation from the Russian forces, and that occurred about 3 weeks ago. And the Ukrainian army continued to conduct strikes on Russian positions all over the South Bank of the river in the Oblast. And since I don't normally show the actual launch footage of these HIMARS missiles, there it is, of which some like to call it a beautiful sight to behold. So some of these very missiles hit Russian locations in occupied Skidovsk and Chaplinka as well. But closer to the front line, there's a bit of shifting sands here. So although Russia continues to shell Kherson and shamefully hitting anything like shops, the actual number of Russian troops and equipment has been diminishing at their Oleshki hideout. And they've been reported as moving to the adjacent forest locations just a few miles south. So this green patch area right here. Because really they were getting absolutely demolished, just like sitting ducks, and really by remaining too stationary at that location for far too long. And also within such close range of the Ukrainian forces that have particularly decent strike capabilities with their regular artillery. But even in the forest region where the Russian forces are moving to, I think they'll still stick out like a sore thumb if they're not properly equipped. For instance, tanks, trucks in winter camo gear, not to mention sufficient winter camo gear for the troops themselves. Then we'll move across, surprisingly, to the occupied city of Jankoy in the Crimean Peninsula, where the Russian forces are preparing for defense. So I've got these photos here of the defensive lines being set up on the road. Russia is clearly starting to accept that it may not be able to realistically gain ground, thus looking to perhaps save themselves from further embarrassment and from further ground losses. And it's truly quite the distance this town from the front line, as you can see right there. So confidence levels must be quite low right now for the Russian forces, but don't worry, there's no reason to panic. Then we'll move across to some news. So the Wagner group, the Wagner militia group, which is Russia's group fighting for Russia in Ukraine, particularly located or predominantly in the Donbass region, they are looking to recruit prisoners from Africa to fight against Ukraine. Now, the Wagner Group has been operating in the Central African Republic for some years now, I think since about 2018, and they're already reportedly in the process of releasing rebels from jail and sending them overseas, including to, you guessed it, Ukraine. So as if recruiting Russian prisoners in the Russian jail system wasn't a desperate enough action, Russia and Wagner combined are really seeming to be grasping at straws, looking for as much additional manpower as they can to fill all the gaps on their front lines. So Russia will do anything it can to try to win, such as more conscripts, more cannon fodder, anything but training their army. Then in some other news, Germany and the US are providing an additional 53 million euros and 56 million US dollars respectively as part of a new aid package to assist Ukraine with its power infrastructure. The funds are going to distribution transformers, circuit breakers, surge arresters, other things like disconnectors, and much more equipment to counteract Russia's strikes on the Ukrainian power grid. Then in some other news, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense announced the arrival of the French LRU multiple launch rocket systems, which are effectively the French variant of the M270s, which are in turn quite similar to the high precision HIMARS systems. And the defense minister said, and I quote, "Ukraine's army is now even more powerful for deterring and destroying the enemy." Then in some other news, Ukraine's general staff said that Russia is preparing a new mobilization campaign, which is for an early February 2023 offensive campaign, which would really go to show that the last 300,000 Russian troops declared for mobilization almost 3 months ago now didn't really pan out the way that Russia wanted it to. And if this is true, another round of mobilization, say for another 300,000 conscripts for instance, then this could really cause a lot of problems for Russia. First of all, the Russian government told their people they'd only mobilize 320,000 conscripts, I think quite specifically there. But then on their official mobilization decree, item number 7, they left blank the true number that they could legally mobilize. So a new round of Russian mobilization will certainly cause internal instability within the country. The citizens took it as quite a shock. It was reported when the first mobilization happened and they weren't that keen on it at all. But other problems for Russia doing this include their ability or inability to supply and train this amount of conscripts. And for the first 300,000, they failed pretty badly at this. And I keep saying this in a lot of older videos, but Russia would really need to have a much larger scale, what they call a general mobilization, for any decent real chance to take Ukraine. But it would be at great cost still to them, and so much loss of life. Then on the lighter side of things today, I've got this video here of Ukrainian soldiers enjoying the first day of winter. I'll let that roll for a second. Then a bit of a funny to round it all off with today, guys. So right in the front of the Russian Military of Defense building in Moscow, there is a billboard right there designed to entice regular Russians in the city, if not already mobilized, to willingly volunteer and sign up for going to war in Ukraine. As you can clearly see, Russia has a manpower problem, a real shortage, if you will. But what I find most interesting is the guy on the billboard is all equipped with his tactical gear, which is so far removed from the reality of the situation for all the conscripts that went to war in Ukraine, who have just been so poorly equipped that it defies any and all military logic as to why you would set up an offensive in the first place. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment, subscribe, hit that like button, and I do hope to see all of you guys there on the next one. Cheers.